Chapter 1. The Foundation, From Mud to Marble. The story of Rome does not begin with the shimmering marble of the Colosseum or the disciplined march of the legions. It begins in the mud. In the 8th century BC, the Italian peninsula was a patchwork of warring tribes, Etruscans to the north, Greeks to the south, and in the center, a rugged group of herdsmen known as the Latins. According to the foundational myth that every Roman schoolchild would eventually learn, the city was born from a dark and divine providence. Romulus and Remus, twin sons of the war god Mars, were abandoned to drown in the Tiber River, only to be saved and suckled by a she-wolf. When they grew to manhood, they chose the Palatine Hill as the site for their new city. But the brothers could not agree on who should rule. In a moment of primal violence that would foreshadow centuries of Roman civil strife, Romulus slew his brother. Rome was baptized in blood, named for its survivor, and founded on the principle that it would answer to no one. For the first 244 years of its existence, Rome was a monarchy. It was ruled by 7 legendary kings, each credited with establishing a pillar of the Roman identity. Romulus gave the city its first senate, a council of elders or patres who would advise the king. His successor, Numa Pompilius, was a man of peace who focused on the gods, establishing the religious calendar and the office of the Pontifex Maximus. As the city grew, it absorbed the sophisticated culture of its northern neighbors, the Etruscans. Under the later Etruscan kings, Rome transformed from a collection of hilltop huts into a true urban center. They drained the marshy lowlands to create the Forum, built the massive temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and constructed the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's first major sewage systems. Rome was becoming a power, but beneath the architectural progress, a resentment was simmering. The monarchy eventually curdled into tyranny. The 7th and final king, Tarquin the Proud, was a man of legendary arrogance who ruled through fear rather than the consent of the Senate. The breaking point came not from a fiscal dispute, but from a violation of Roman honor, the rape of the noble woman Lucretia by the king's son. Lucretia's subsequent suicide became a rallying cry for the Roman aristocracy. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, the people rose in a fervor of righteous indignation. They didn't just exile Tarquin, they abolished the very concept of kingship. To the Romans, the word rex, king, became the ultimate slur, a symbol of everything a free man should loathe. In 509 BC, the gates were slammed shut on the monarchy forever. In the vacuum left by the kings, the Romans did something revolutionary. They created the res publica, the public affair. This was a government designed specifically to ensure that no single man could ever hold absolute power again. They replaced the king with 2 consuls, elected annually, who held the power of imperium but could veto one another's decisions. This power of the no became the heartbeat of Roman politics. Alongside the consuls sat the Senate, a body of aristocracies who controlled the treasury and foreign policy. It was a fragile, experimental system, born of a deep-seated paranoia towards autocracy. As the sun set on the era of the kings, Rome stood as a small, defiant city-state, surrounded by enemies and governed by a complicated web of laws. They had no idea that this small patch of land by the Tiber was destined to become the capital of the world.
Chapter 2. The Res Publica. The Struggle for the Soul of Rome. With the kings expelled, Rome did not immediately become a land of equality. Instead, it became a battlefield for a different kind of war, a domestic struggle between 2 distinct social classes. On one side were the patricians, the aristocratic elite who claimed descent from the original 100 senators appointed by Romulus. They held a monopoly on political office, the priesthood, and the law. On the other side were the plebeians, the multitude of commoners, farmers, artisans, and merchants, who made up the backbone of the Roman army, but possessed almost no political rights. This internal conflict, known as the struggle of the orders, would define the next 2 centuries. The plebeians realized that while the patricians held the titles, the commoners held the leverage. In a series of dramatic secessions, the plebeian soldiers simply marched out of the city and refused to fight until their demands were met. These strikes forced the hand of the aristocracy and led to the creation of the tribune of the plebes. This was one of the most unique political offices in human history. A tribune's person was sacrosanct. To harm one was a capital offense, and they possessed the power of the veto. With a single word, a tribune could halt any law, any election, or any decree of the Senate that they deemed harmful to the common people. To further ensure fairness, the Romans codified their laws for the first time in the 12 Tables. No longer could patrician judges make up the rules as they went. The law was now literally carved in bronze and displayed in the forum for all to see. This balance of power, the Senate representing the wisdom of the elite and the tribunes representing the will of the people, created a political stability that was unheard of in the ancient world. However, while Rome was busy debating law in the forum, it was also fighting for its life on the battlefield. The young republic was surrounded by hostile neighbors, the Etruscans to the north, the Volsci to the south, and the fierce Aequi in the mountains. This was an era of defensive aggression. The Romans believed, or at least told themselves, that they only fight just wars to protect their allies or their territory. Yet every victory resulted in more land, and every piece of land required more soldiers to defend it. It was during this period that the Roman military began to evolve from a Greek-style phalanx into the more flexible maniple system, the legion with joints, which allowed them to fight effectively on the rugged, uneven terrain of the Italian peninsula. The ultimate test of Roman resilience came in 390 BC, when a screaming horde of Gauls from the north descended upon the city. The Roman army was shattered at the Battle of the Allia, and for the first and only time in 800 years, the city of Rome was sacked. The Gauls occupied the city, leaving only the Capitoline Hill under Roman control. Legend tells us that when the Romans weighed out gold to pay the Gauls to leave, the Gallic chieftain Brennus threw his heavy sword onto the scales, shouting, "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. This humiliation left a permanent scar on the Roman psyche. It instilled a deep-seated fear of the barbarian and a fanatical devotion to military strength. From that moment on, Rome vowed it would never be the victim again. By the mid-3rd century BC, through a combination of brutal warfare and clever diplomacy, Rome had achieved the impossible. It had unified the entire Italian peninsula under its banner. They did not just conquer their neighbors, they turned them into soci, or allies. These allies were required to provide troops for Rome's wars, and in exchange they shared in the spoils of victory and the protection of the Roman shield. Rome was no longer a city-state, it was the head of a massive Italian confederation. But as the Romans looked out from the southern tip of Italy across the narrow straits of Messina, they saw a new rival watching them from the shores of North Africa. The stage was set for the greatest conflict of the ancient world.
Chapter 3. The Punic Wars. The Clash of Titans. By 264 BC, Rome's expansion had brought it to the very tip of the Italian boot, looking across the narrow straits of Messina at Sicily. But they weren't the only power in the neighborhood. Across the Mediterranean sat Carthage, a glittering, wealthy Phoenician metropolis in modern-day Tunisia. Carthage was the undisputed mistress of the seas, possessing a navy that could turn the Mediterranean into a Carthaginian lake. Rome, by contrast, was a land power with almost no maritime tradition. When a local dispute in Sicily drew both powers into the fray, it ignited the First Punic War, a 20-year slog that forced Rome to do the unthinkable, build a navy from scratch. Legend says they found a wrecked Carthaginian quinquereme on a beach and reverse-engineered it, adding a corvus, a spiked boarding bridge that turned sea battles into land battles on water. Rome won by sheer stubborn attrition, seizing Sicily and Sardinia and leaving Carthage humiliated and broke. But the peace was merely a breathing room. In the shadows of Spain, a young Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca was raised on an oath of eternal hatred toward Rome. In 218 BC, he launched the Second Punic War, performing a feat that the Romans thought was physically impossible. He led an army of tens of thousands of men and dozens of war elephants across the frozen, jagged peaks of the Alps and descended into northern Italy. Hannibal was a tactical genius, a ghost who haunted the Italian countryside for 15 years. At the Battle of Cannae, he executed a perfect double envelopment, trapping and slaughtering nearly 80,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon. It remains to this day the bloodiest single day of combat in Western history. The Senate panicked, the gates of Rome were barred, the very end of the Republic seemed at hand. Yet,
This is where the Roman character revealed its terrifying strength. In the face of total annihilation, Rome refused to negotiate. They didn't surrender, they doubled down. They raised new legions, including slaves and criminals, and adopted the Fabian strategy, a war of exhaustion where they avoided direct battle with Hannibal while systematically cutting off his supplies. Eventually, a young Roman general named Scipio, later called Africanus, realized that to defeat Hannibal, he had to stop fighting him in Italy. Scipio took the war to Spain and then to the gates of Carthage itself. In 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics against him, finally breaking the Carthaginian army. Carthage was stripped of its empire, its navy, and its pride. The Third Punic War, decades later, was less of a war and more of a cold-blooded execution. Driven by the statesman Cato the Elder, who ended every speech with the phrase "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed, Rome returned to finish the job. In 146 BC, they breached the walls, burned the city to the ground, and sold the surviving population into slavery. Legend says they even sowed the earth with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. In that same year, Rome also crushed the Greek city of Corinth. By the end of this chapter, the Mediterranean was no longer a shared space. It was Mare Nostrum, our sea. Rome had become an accidental empire, but the sudden influx of unimaginable wealth and millions of slaves was about to rot the Republic from the inside out.
Chapter 4. The Republic in Flames. The Cost of Conquest. By 1460 BC, Rome was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, but the spoils of victory were a poison disguised as a gift. The influx of unimaginable wealth, hundreds of thousands of slaves, and vast stretches of conquered land did not enrich the average Roman citizen. Instead, it decimated them. For centuries, the backbone of the Roman legions had been the small-scale farmer soldier, men who left their plows to fight for the Republic. But as Rome's wars grew longer and further away, these men returned home to find their farms in ruin, unable to compete with the latifundia. These were massive, industrial-sized plantations owned by the wealthy senatorial elite and worked by cheap, imported slave labor. The displaced farmers, now landless and unemployed, flooded into the city of Rome, creating a volatile, angry urban underclass. The social contract that had held the Republic together for centuries was beginning to snap. In 133 BC, a young aristocrat named Tiberius Gracchus attempted to fix the system through radical reform. As a tribune of the plebs, he proposed a land redistribution bill that would take public land held illegally by the rich and give it back to the poor and landless veterans. To the Senate, this wasn't just a policy dispute, it was a declaration of class war. They viewed Tiberius as a budding tyrant seeking to buy the loyalty of the masses. In a shocking breach of Roman tradition, a group of senators and their followers armed themselves with wooden clubs and furniture, cornering Tiberius in the forum and beating him to death. It was the first time in nearly 400 years that political blood had been shed in the streets of Rome. The sacrosanct office of the tribune had been violated, and the precedent was set. In the new Rome, if you couldn't win an argument with a vote, you won it with a club. 10 years later, Tiberius's brother, Gaius Gracchus, picked up the mantle of reform, pushing for even more radical changes, including subsidized grain and citizenship for Rome's Italian allies. He too met a violent end, hunted down by a senatorial death squad. These murders split Roman politics into two bitter factions: the optimates, the best men, who defended the traditional power of the Senate, and the populares, who sought to bypass the Senate by appealing directly to the people. The Republic was no longer a collaborative public affair. It was a zero-sum game of survival. Into this fractured landscape stepped a new kind of leader, the new man, Gaius Marius. A brilliant general, but a political outsider, Marius solved the army's recruitment crisis by allowing the landless poor to enlist. For the first time, Roman soldiers were no longer fighting for the Republic. They were fighting for their general, who provided their pay and promised them land in retirement. This shift,
from a national army to a private one, led directly to the First Great Civil War. When Marius's former lieutenant, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, was denied a prestigious military command, he did the unthinkable. He turned his legions around and marched on Rome itself. Sulla became the first Roman to use the city's own army to capture it, declaring himself dictator for the constitution. He published proscription lists, bounties on the heads of his political enemies, and executed thousands of citizens without trial. Sulla eventually retired, hoping his bloody purge had restored the Senate's power, but he had actually shown the world the blueprint for the Republic's destruction. He had proven that any man with enough legions could hold the city hostage. Among those who watched Sulla's rise with keen, calculating eyes was a young man from an impoverished but noble family, Gaius Julius Caesar.
Chapter 5. The Colossus. The Death of the Republic. By 60 BC, the Roman Republic was a hollow shell, a government of laws increasingly ruled by men of swords. Into this vacuum stepped the most famous name in history, Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was a master of the populares playbook, charming, deeply in debt, and brilliantly attuned to the frustrations of the Roman street. To seize control, he formed a shadow government known as the First Triumvirate, an uneasy alliance with the two most powerful men in Rome, Crassus, the richest man in the world, and Pompey the Great, the Republic's most celebrated general. Together, they bypassed the Senate entirely, carving up the Roman world like a private estate. Caesar took the governorship of Gaul, modern-day France, knowing that to truly rule Rome, he needed what Sulla and Marius had, a devoted army and a mountain of gold. For 8 years, Caesar waged a brutal campaign of conquest across the Rhine and the English Channel. He didn't just expand Rome's borders, he conducted a masterclass in self-promotion, sending home glowing reports of his victories that made him a hero to the masses. By the time the Gallic Wars ended, Caesar had enslaved 1 million people and killed 1 million more. But he had also forged the most battle-hardened war machine the world had ever seen. However, the triumvirate had collapsed. Crassus had died in a disastrous campaign against the Parthians, and Pompey, fearing Caesar's growing shadow, had realigned himself with the Senate's optimates. The message sent to Caesar was clear: disband your army and return to Rome to face trial for your political crimes, or be declared an enemy of the state. In January of 49 BC, Caesar reached the Rubicon, a small river marking the boundary between his province and Italy. To cross it with an army was an act of high treason. Caesar paused, then uttered the famous words, "Alia jacta est," the die is cast. He didn't just cross a river, he crossed a point of no return. The resulting civil war spanned the entire Mediterranean, from the plains of Greece to the deserts of Egypt. Pompey, the teenage butcher turned defender of the Republic, was eventually defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus and murdered in Egypt. Caesar emerged as the sole master of the Roman world. He returned to Rome not as a consul, but as dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. Caesar was a visionary who understood the Republic was broken. He began a whirlwind of reforms. He overhauled the calendar, gave land to veterans, and extended citizenship to the provinces. But to the Roman aristocracy, his mercy was more insulting than his violence. By wearing the purple robes of a king and placing his face on coins, Caesar had offended the deepest Roman taboo. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, a conspiracy of 60 senators, led by his friend Brutus and the embittered Cassius, cornered Caesar at a meeting of the Senate. They stabbed him 23 times, leaving him to bleed out at the base of a statue of his old rival, Pompey. The assassins shouted that liberty had been restored, but they had made a fatal calculation. They had killed the man, but they could not kill the reality he had created. The Republic was dead. The only question left was who would inherit its remains. Chapter 6. The Augustan settlement, the birth of an empire. The assassins of Julius Caesar had a plan for the murder, but they had no plan for the morning after. They expected the Republic to miraculously restart like a stalled engine, but instead, the city spiraled into a decade of even more savage civil war. Out of the chaos emerged an unlikely heir, a sickly 18-year-old great-nephew of Caesar named Octavian. While the world looked at the charismatic Mark Antony as Caesar's natural successor, Octavian possessed a cold, calculating brilliance that would eventually outmaneuver every veteran general in Rome. He formed the second triumvirate with Antony and Lepidus, and their first act was a bloodbath. They hunted down Caesar's assassins and purged the Senate of their enemies, including the great orator Cicero, whose head and hands were nailed to the speaker's platform in the Forum. The alliance was a marriage of convenience that inevitably soured. The Roman world was split down the middle. Octavian ruled the west from Rome, while Mark Antony ruled the east from the arms of the Egyptian queen, Cleopatra. Octavian, a master of propaganda, portrayed the coming conflict not as a civil war between Romans, but as a crusade for Roman values against an Oriental queen who had bewitched a Roman general. In 31 BC, the two sides met at the naval battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, led by his loyal friend and military genius Agrippa, crushed the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers fled to Egypt and committed suicide, leaving Octavian as the last man standing in a world weary of blood. Octavian faced a delicate problem. If he called himself a king, he would be stabbed like Caesar. If he gave up power, the Republic would collapse back into chaos. His solution was a stroke of political genius known as the Augustan settlement. In 27 BC, he walked into the Senate and restored the Republic, handing back his emergency powers. In return, the grateful Senate gave him the title Augustus, the revered one, and granted him legal control over the army and the most important provinces. He never called himself king or emperor. He called himself princeps or first citizen. It was a brilliant facade. The old institutions of the Republic, the Senate, the consuls, the elections, continued to function on the surface, but underneath, every string was pulled by Augustus. The Republic had become an empire in everything but name. The reign of Augustus inaugurated the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, a 200-year period of relative stability that allowed the Mediterranean world to flourish as never before. Augustus didn't just rule, he rebuilt. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He established the first permanent firefighting force, the first police force, the urban cohorts, and the elite Praetorian Guard to protect the emperor. He professionalized the army, ensuring soldiers were paid by the state rather than individual generals, finally breaking the cycle of military coups. When Augustus died in 14 AD, he had ruled for over 40 years. He had stayed in power so long that almost no one alive remembered what a free republic looked like. The Roman Empire was no longer a temporary necessity. It was the new reality of the world. Chapter 7. The Zenith. The Five Good Emperors. Following the death of Augustus, the empire entered a century of transition that saw the highs of administrative brilliance and the lows of psychological madness. The first citizen model was tested by the likes of Caligula and Nero, whose erratic reigns proved that the system was only as stable as the man at the top. However, after the bloody civil war of 69 AD and the rise of the Flavian dynasty, who gifted the world the iconic Colosseum, Rome entered its golden age. This period, known as the era of the Five Good Emperors, represented the absolute peak of Roman power, culture, and administrative efficiency. For nearly a century, the throne was not passed through blood, but through adoption.
Each emperor chose the most capable man in the empire to be his successor. The era reached its territorial maximum under Trajan, the first emperor born outside of Italy. A soldier at heart, Trajan pushed the Roman borders further than they had ever been or would ever be again. He crossed the Danube to conquer Dacia, modern-day Romania, seizing its vast gold mines to fund massive public works in Rome, and marched his legions as far east as the Persian Gulf. Under Trajan, the empire spanned 3 continents, from the rainy mists of northern Britain to the burning sands of the Sahara, and from the Atlantic coast to the Tigris River. It was a world of globalized trade, where a Roman citizen in Londinium could drink Spanish wine, wear Egyptian linen, and eat North African grain, all while protected by a single set of laws. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, realized that an empire this massive could not be expanded indefinitely. He shifted the Roman strategy from conquest to consolidation. He famously traveled to every province in the empire, inspecting the troops and the borders. In Britain, he ordered the construction of Hadrian's Wall, a 73-mile stone barrier that served as a psychological and physical stop sign for the Roman world. Hadrian was an intellectual and an architect. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, with its massive concrete dome that remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world today. This was an era of soft power, where the Roman way of life, the baths, the theaters, the aqueducts, became the aspiration of every person living within the borders. The Golden Age concluded with Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. His reign was spent not in the luxury of Rome, but in the cold, muddy trenches of the Danubian frontier, holding back the first major waves of Germanic tribal incursions. Amidst the carnage of war and the devastation of the Antonine Plague, one of the first recorded pandemics that decimated the Roman population, Aurelius wrote his Meditations, a core text of Stoic philosophy. He preached duty, endurance, and the brevity of life. But in his final act, he broke the tradition of adoption and left the empire to his biological son, Commodus. It was a fatal mistake. As Marcus Aurelius died in a military camp in 180 AD, the Golden Age died with him. The light of the Pax Romana began to flicker, and the long, slow slide into the 3rd century crisis had begun.
Chapter 8. The Century of Chaos. The Empire on the Brink. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD marked the end of an era and the beginning of a nightmare. His son, Commodus, was no philosopher. He was a narcissist who fancied himself a reincarnated Hercules, fighting as a gladiator in the Colosseum while the administration of the empire rotted. His assassination in 192 AD triggered a century of instability that nearly wiped Rome from the map. This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, was a perfect storm of systemic failures: civil war, foreign invasion, plague, and economic collapse. The barracks emperors, men who seized the throne through military coups, only to be murdered by their own troops months later, became the new norm. In a span of just 50 years, there were no fewer than 26 claimants to the imperial title. As the central government in Rome fractured, the borders began to bleed. To the east, the newly energized Sassanid Persians captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle, a humiliation previously unthinkable, and allegedly used him as a footstool. To the north, Germanic tribes like the Goths and Alamae realized that the Roman legions were too busy fighting each other to guard the Rhine and Danube frontiers. They poured into Gaul, Italy, and even Greece, sacking cities that hadn't seen a foreign enemy in centuries. The empire actually physically split apart, A Gallic empire broke away in the west, and the Palmyrian Empire, led by the formidable Queen Zenobia, seized Egypt and the Levant in the east. For a few dark decades, it appeared that the Roman experiment had finally reached its expiration date. The chaos was fueled by a catastrophic economic death spiral. To pay the ever-increasing demands of the soldiers who put them in power, emperors debased the currency. They took the silver denarius and replaced most of its silver content with copper and lead. The result was hyperinflation. Prices for basic goods like grain skyrocketed, and the Roman middle class was wiped out. Trade, the lifeblood of the empire, ground to a halt as roads became unsafe and the money became worthless. People began to flee the cities for the countryside, seeking the protection of wealthy landowners in exchange for their labor, a shift that planted the early seeds of what would one day become medieval feudalism. The man who finally pulled the empire back from the abyss was a stern Illyrian general named Diocletian. Rising to power in 284 AD, he realized that the empire had become too massive and too complex for one man to rule from a single city. He performed a radical surgery on the state, creating the Tetrarchy, or the Rule of Four. He split the empire into east and west, with 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, Caesars. He moved the administrative capitals away from Rome to cities closer to the frontiers, like Milan and Nicomedia. Diocletian stabilized the borders and the economy through sheer force of will and a massive expansion of the bureaucracy. The empire was saved, but the price was high. The old first citizen facade of Augustus was gone, replaced by a rigid Oriental-style autocracy, where the emperor was no longer a leader, but a lord and god.
Chapter 9. The Cross and the Eagle. The Constantine Revolution. The stability brought by Diocletian's Tetrarchy was short-lived. As soon as the Iron Emperor retired to his palace to grow cabbages, his system of shared power dissolved into a series of brutal civil wars. From the smoke of this conflict emerged Constantine the Great, a man who would fundamentally redirect the course of Western history. In 312 AD, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly had a vision of a cross in the sky with the inscription, "In hoc signo vinces," "In this sign you shall conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint a Christian symbol, the Chi-Rho, on their shields. His victory didn't just make him the sole ruler of the West, it signaled the end of centuries of Christian persecution and the beginning of an alliance between the Church and the state. Constantine's impact was twofold. First, through the Edict of Milan, he legalized Christianity, transforming it from a persecuted underground sect into the favored religion of the imperial court. This wasn't just a spiritual shift, it was a political one. Constantine saw in the unified Christian church a social glue that could bind the fracturing empire together. He convened the Council of Nicaea to settle theological disputes, marking the first time an emperor presided over church doctrine. Suddenly, the Roman eagle and the Christian cross were flying on the same banners. However, this merger also created a new source of internal conflict, as religious heresy now became a matter of state security. The second pillar of Constantine's legacy was the New Rome. Recognizing that the economic and military heart of the empire had shifted to the east, he founded a new capital on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. He named it Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. Strategically located at the crossroads of Europe and Asia and protected by impregnable seawalls, Constantinople was far more defensible and wealthy than the old, crumbling city of Rome. For the next 1,000 years, this city would serve as the bastion of Roman law and Greek culture. But while Constantinople flourished, the city of Rome began to feel like a relic of the past, increasingly isolated from the centers of power. By the time Constantine died in 337 AD, the empire was a different creature entirely. It was now a Christian, bureaucratic autocracy with its eyes turned toward the east. The old pagan traditions were fading, and the Senate in Rome had become little more than a glorified city council. Constantine had given the empire a second life, but in doing so, he had accelerated the divergence between the East and the West. As the 4th century drew to a close, the great migrations of Germanic and Hunnic tribes began to exert an unbearable pressure on the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The Roman world was about to face its final, agonizing test.
Chapter 10. The Shadow of Rome. the long goodbye. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was a house divided, and the storms gathering outside its doors were no longer mere raids, but the movement of entire nations. Driven by the terrifying advance of the Huns, nomadic horsemen from Central Asia, Germanic tribes like the Visigoths and Vandals pushed desperately against the Roman frontiers. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Eastern Roman army was annihilated, and the Emperor Valens was killed by Gothic rebels. It was a seismic shock. The barbarians were no longer just at the gate, they were inside the house, and the Roman military, now largely composed of Germanic mercenaries themselves, lacked the strength to evict them. The unthinkable happened in 410 AD. For the first time in 800 years, the city of Rome was captured and sacked by a foreign enemy, the Visigoths under Alaric. The physical damage was significant, but the psychological damage was terminal. Across the empire, from the villas of Britain to the churches of North Africa, people asked, if Rome can fall, what is safe? St. Jerome wrote from Bethlehem, the city which has taken the whole world is itself taken. The Western Empire began to dissolve into a collection of Germanic kingdoms. Britain was abandoned, Gaul was carved up by the Franks and Burgundians, and North Africa, the empire's breadbasket, was seized by the Vandals, who eventually sailed across the sea to sack Rome a second time in 455 AD. The end, when it finally came in 476 AD, was almost an anticlimax. A Germanic general named Odoacer, serving in the Roman army, decided he had no more use for puppet emperors. He deposed the last Western emperor, a teenager ironically named Romulus Augustulus, carrying the names of both Rome's founder and its first emperor. Odoacer did not claim the imperial title for himself. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that one emperor was enough for the world. The Western Roman Empire, as a political entity, had ceased to exist. The lights went out across Europe, ushering in the fragmented, localized era we now call the Middle Ages. Yet Rome did not truly die, it transformed. In the East, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, would endure for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, Greek philosophy, and the title of Roman until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. In the West, the Latin language evolved into the Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. The Roman Catholic Church adopted the administrative structure of the empire, with the Pope taking the old title of Pontifex Maximus. Our modern legal systems, our calendar, and our very concept of the state are all ghosts of a civilization that collapsed 15 centuries ago. We no longer walk the streets of the Caesars, but we live in the world they built. The story of Rome is not just a history of a city, it is the biography of the Western world.